Hey everybody. It's foggy in the garden here today. Not densely. We often get the sea breeze here. And in my neighborhood, fog's comes almost nightly, right? Not always close to the ground though. And in the landscape here, the fog makes things a little more ambiguous. Just slightly less distinct. And it strikes me that, given the circumstances in which we're living at the moment, that there's something like a flood of ambiguity, almost of biblical proportions, right? Aspects of our lives that were previously relatively stable, honestly predictable, relatively dependable, have changed. And it's much harder for most of us to make sense of the anchors around which we previously wove meaning. And most of those are representations. And it's as if this kind of flood of ambiguity is overcoming the representations. And the humans, for their part, keep representing things, just like they did yesterday, believing that if they do it harder or faster or in more new domains per day, they'll stay ahead of the wave. It's not likely. It's extremely unlikely that anything like that is true. But one way to think about the representations is as ways to skip relation, to skip over actually having to be present, aware, engaged, reasonably inspired, to skip over that and get the little tchotchke at the end as a token that represents all that was actually evicted by that convenience. That's a game that terminates itself and its players. And it does damage all along the way. And generally the damage is exported from the actual endeavors that cause the damage. That damage gets exported into nature, the poor, the disadvantaged, the marginalized in general. But nature first. And as she has no voice, we do not hear her cry. Most of us. Many of us. So, what can we do? Well, none of us was able to address the fact that our nations developed atomic weapons. We tried to do various things about it as a society. Most of them didn't work very well. At the huge scale, at the broadest scale, the scale of humanity, we have to stop serving representations. And I realize this probably sounds biblical, but maybe it should. We have to stop serving representations of things and actually begin to enter into meaningful, purposeful, creative, intelligent relation over things that truly matter. So as the ambiguity floods the metropolises of representation that we've been serving, the institutions, the corporations, the governments, and by the way, most of those things are almost pure malware, so we've been serving pirates, right? We've been serving, well, we've been serving fictions. Very lethal fictions, malignant fictions. So we'll probably have to start serving something other than that, to whatever degree we possibly can. And we might become aware that the headlong plunge into further representation, we could back the fuck off of that a bit. Yeah? We could take a moment to breathe and ask ourselves, if for every new way we become connected, we lose 5 ways that were meaningful, when the field of play is representations. Right? None of us have been very capable of doing the cost accounting for departing from relationships into representations, but we feel it in our bodies. We feel it in our hearts, in our dreaming, in our waking world. We feel unspoken necessities aligned with the essence of being human, uniquely yet completely for every human being. And this is the opportunity of relation, of deep, meaningful relation. With ourselves, with the world, with thought, how we use it, what we allow it to be used for, what we refuse to do, turns out to be really important in this game. What we don't do so that the space is clear for something else to be born. Yeah? Between us. In the between of us. When 2 or more of us are truly together, we acquire wings in skies we have not been bold enough to imagine. And we were born for flight in those skies. Together, in relation. For purposes true and noble. Essential and meaningful. So as ambiguity floods in, the habitual let's go forward mindset tries to break it down, reduce the scope of inquiry, use tools within that scope that are trustworthy, and figure out, in other words, make a new representation of what's going on. But most of what's going on is that representations are being made in language, in ideation, in thought. And there's a point at which the fact you have more information is not only unhelpful, it's catastrophic. Because information, in its relatively concrete sense, how should I put this? Let's see. When I speak of information, I'm speaking about things like the tokens and narratives and models and theories that are traded in public. So maybe I should call that something else. I'll call it signals. Yeah. No, that's too general too. Kind of stuck here. Little packets of communication in media. It's media. That field of play has been thoroughly infected with processes that make it very difficult for us to use the figuring out method adequately. Though there are still plenty of terrains in which it's, relatively useful and maybe sometimes appropriate. But in the circumstances we're in now, where ambiguity is flooding in, it might not be the right move to double down on making new representations of things. Especially if by doing so, we will depart the opportunity of meaningful collectivity, even on a very small scale, say 5 people. We have to keep that small scale in mind because it's low-hanging fruit. You can do it with 5 people almost immediately, in a context where those people are motivated and interested and inspired and so on. So perhaps we'll have to develop new senses that don't depend on representation, or retrieve those we had before the world turned into a swarming morass of frameworks and products and objects and computers and weapons. So we might be able to back gently up from the representations together and recognize that our hope, the hope of intelligence and awareness, the hope of consciousness, the hope of something actually resembling a society, the hope of meaningful roles in our lives, an adventure for purposes true and noble. In the womb of ambiguity, astonishing transformations are possible, even over very short periods of time. We will surely see the shadows of this. But some of us will become little sources of illumination. Of creative intelligence together, forming and inhabiting relationships together. In ways we've heard and seen in stories, but have too rarely lived. In ambiguity, figuring things out, it's not that you want to stop, but there's more than one other mode for humans in general. And when we come to a context or situation or idea or purpose, something is motivating us paying attention to whatever it is. We have both conscious and subconscious motivations. The purpose to know what something is a very specific one. And it differs from the purpose of to be transformed by relation with toward a shared objective. That second one is much more ambiguous, and it doesn't result in concrete declarations of identity or role or meaning. It leaves them amorphous, and it transforms within that cloud toward, in various directions, right? In accord with its purpose. So purpose underlies our sense-making capacities, in a manner of speaking. When we try to make sense of something, there's a reason, not exactly a reason, but again, a purpose underlying that that's motivating us. And there's a lot of fascinating things to be learned by watching ourselves engaged in the process of determining what to pay attention to. And this might be very particularly important now, more so than it's ever been, because in general, at the broad scale of humanity, pretty much everyone's paying attention to stuff that either will get us killed, or is useless, or is actually the result of having previously disposed of meaning, value, relation, engagement, mutuality, right? So we've got a world filled with the skeletal remains of relationships, filled with the skeletal remains of what could have been societies. And we're all doubling down on worshiping these and serving them harder and harder, faster and faster, in more new ways per moment. We live in the wreckage of an epoch in which the humans went insane making things and dismissing other things and defecting from the essential beauty of the potentials with which we've become invested. But that's speaking very generally. Each one of us walks, in a sense, alone. We have to make actual decisions, not broad philosophical generalizations. We have to actually buy food, work jobs, try to understand what's meaningful. As the slaves of these multi-layered metropolises of representations, from jobs themselves to language to, media, corporations, institutions, the government, bad actors. It's a very dangerous world. And we're probably going to be coming to times of ever greater danger and more ambiguity. So we'll need some way to meaningfully engage the actual situation. Not the one we hope for, the one that we can understand and learn to see together when we begin to actually see together. Most of our potentials as human beings are not situated with the individual. In a representational framework, that can fly. You can have a guy at the top. In a relational framework, it doesn't really work that way. Unless humans have adopted a relational framework to tell them what to do in a relationship and to declare the identities verbatim and the roles verbatim. That's the collapse of the possibility of relation into representation. So maybe it's time for us to go backwards, right? To stop rushing forwards into further representations of representing things for purposes, and back away from that toward and into meaningful relation with and for each other, with and for nature. And we can all do some of that. Because I think we left some of our light behind us in this mad rush. And if we'll go back, perhaps we'll see in new ways that rushing forward is not delivering. Ladies and gentlemen, back away from the representations, please. Into meaningful relationship with each other, with ourselves, with our dreaming, with our bodies, with our hearts, with our neighbors, with all the people. Whether things continue along the lines they're presently going and don't collapse, or they do, this compass point matters deeply. And if they do go toward catastrophe, to the degree that they do, people will recognize that relationships matter. When I go to the grocery store, the fact that those people are risking their lives so I can get food is not lost on me. And I tell them, and I thank them. Because inside the representations in which we live, food is delivered to us, right? We have to buy it, but there's a supply chain. I'm really grateful to the people who do their jobs every day, even though at the same time, they, like me, like most of you, we're serving that representational metropolis that's eating the history and future of life on Earth and spitting out little objects and commodities and garbage and pollution. Things that none of us would choose to do, I think. And yet to which we did subscribe for the convenience, for the skipping over. Now the fog is thick and it's much more ambiguous. I think we need the senses that belong to the aspect of our essence that is blind and sees by feeling, not mere emotion, not outrage, no, by sensitive intimacy with things. If there are two brothers or sisters inside us, one of them is like this. It's blind, but it's incredibly sensitive, and it feels along the transports of intimacy with integrity. This aspect is incapable of lying. It may not get everything perfectly right, but it won't tell a verbal fiction. And it won't recruit you to a fiction. And if it has a voice, it's a very, very quiet voice. And it'll usually only say one or two words. No, don't do that. It's one of them. It's good with no. And wait. Those are its two favorite words. How many times has it told me to wait when I was changing lanes in my car? And all it said was wait. And every time it did that, there was a car in my blind spot. And even though I had looked over my shoulder and, done the things I'm trained to do as a careful driver, I didn't see that car in my blind spot, but something in me did. And it never seemed like it was even me. This aspect of our humanity is about to become incredibly preciously valuable, because that aspect is used to ambiguity. What it's an expert with is transformations over time. And this is the aspect that is involved in our dreaming. We're used to using our mind-like sight, what we see with our minds, to figure things out, to disambiguate them, and thus declare their identity, producing the convenience of us no longer having to pay attention to them. That's not without utility, but in the wrong situation, that thing's deadly. And if that thing thinks it's a god, it's twice as deadly, or 10 times as deadly, or gets deadlier each moment. And that's essentially the situation we're in. We've come to the point in human cognitive evolution where language can declare identity to human beings. This is a hammer. That is a shield. That is this kind of person. This is that kind of person. Language can declare it. We've collapsed representationally to the point that we no longer recognize that language is a game. And it's not programming code. Even though for we who are entranced with it, it can have not entirely dissimilar effects. It's one of the subtlest, dangerous things, and one of the most dangerous in our common everyday experience of life. Just this, language. Very, very dangerous stuff. We should, by now, be able to teach each other the skills that are required to play with language intelligently. But as yet, our species has not climbed that ladder rung of our development. So for the moment, we produce language we become subject to. Does that sound like fun for you? Would you sign up for that? And we do this with our minds. So there are other modes. And one of them is the blind twin, who is sensitive to intimacies, ambiguity, and transformations over time. And does not speak, and does not try to tell us what to do, who to be, but instead perhaps reminds us when that's not a good path, or we should slow down and wait a moment until our senses catch up to the blind one, whose seeing, though different, is faster, older, absolutely reliable, so ancient, goes back to the origins of life. That framework stuff's pretty new, comparatively, and is prone to get out of control. So my hope is that we can back away from the representations a bit together and understand that the actual embodiment of our humanity lies with each other, together, in relational intimacy that has integrity and sincerity, is creative, intelligent, efficient, effective, but beautiful, truly worthy of our trust and commitment. And even if we shall only do this in small groups over relatively small periods of time, that's a powerful antidote. If it became contagious, we'd learn things about our humanity that we've been shown too many representations of and had too few experiences of together. I hear the hummingbirds. Those birds change time. Thanks for joining me. See you next time.